Daniel thought the cruise would save his marriage, but by the time the ship reached open waters, he was standing on the top deck watching his wife disappear into the shadows with another man, unaware that this night would end in blood and flashing lights. Ethan was a man whose life from the outside seemed enviable in every possible way. He had built a thriving business from nothing, turning his determination and sharp instincts into a steady source of wealth. His home was a sprawling modern house with gleaming glass walls, expensive cars lined his driveway, and his social media showed pictures of expensive dinners, charity events, and luxury vacations. But all of that was the image he carefully maintained. Behind closed doors, his marriage to Claire had been growing colder for years. The once passionate connection they shared had been replaced by long silences, polite smiles, and the kind of distance that can only form when two people slowly stop caring about each other's inner worlds. Ethan, however, was determined to change that. He thought a grand gesture might be the key to saving their relationship. That is how the idea of the cruise came about, a 10-day trip on a luxury liner sailing through pristine tropical waters. It was the kind of experience people dreamed about. He told himself it would be their chance to rediscover each other away from the noise of their everyday lives. From the moment they boarded the ship, Ethan noticed that Claire seemed different. She smiled for the photos, but her eyes seemed elsewhere. When they reached their cabin, she quickly unpacked and announced she wanted to explore on her own. He didn't think much of it at first. The ship was enormous, with multiple restaurants, swimming pools, casinos, and observation areas. It wasn't strange for her to want to wander, but as the day went on, Ethan saw less and less of her. She missed the welcome dinner, choosing instead to spend time at the spa, which he later discovered closed earlier than she claimed to have returned. That small inconsistency planted a seed in his mind. He brushed it aside, convincing himself that she simply wanted space and that maybe giving her that freedom would make her warm up to him again. But a quiet unease began to settle in his chest. The second day of the cruise only deepened that feeling. Ethan woke early, planning to have breakfast with Claire, but she was already gone. A folded note on the table said she was trying the gym, but when he passed the gym later that morning, she wasn't there. When she finally appeared back at the cabin, she was freshly showered and avoided explaining where she had been. Ethan let it go, but a creeping suspicion was beginning to form, a suspicion he didn't want to admit to himself. His mind began to replay moments from the past few months, the way she had started guarding her phone, the nights she claimed to be meeting friends but came home hours later than expected, the sudden change in her clothing choices. Everything he had ignored at home now seemed amplified in the closed environment of the ship. That evening, the cruise staff organized a lively deck party under the stars. Music played from large speakers, and guests danced under strings of lights. Ethan scanned the crowd, looking for Claire, and that's when he noticed her at the far end of the deck. She was standing close to a man wearing the ship's uniform: white shirt, dark trousers, name badge glinting under the lights. He was tall, with a confident posture, and seemed to be leaning in toward her as if sharing a private joke. She laughed in a way Ethan hadn't seen in months, her body angled toward him in an intimate way that made Ethan's stomach tighten. When the man spotted Ethan looking, he offered a casual nod before walking away, disappearing into the crowd. Claire rejoined Ethan a few minutes later, acting as though nothing had happened. That night, Ethan lay awake in their cabin while Claire slept soundly beside him. His mind kept drifting back to the man in uniform. He thought about how comfortable she had looked with him, how her whole expression had changed in his presence. Was this just innocent friendliness, or was it something more? He hated himself for even thinking it, but the thought wouldn't go away. He decided to pay closer attention over the next few days, not to confront her outright but to observe quietly. If there was nothing going on, he could reassure himself and move forward. If there was, he didn't know what he would do. On the third morning, Ethan followed Claire from a distance. She left the cabin wearing a sundress and sunglasses, heading toward one of the side staircases that led to the upper levels. She didn't notice him trailing her in the crowd. He saw her pause at the entrance to a staff-only hallway, glance around, and then continue walking toward one of the ship's smaller decks. A few minutes later, the same uniformed man from the party appeared from the opposite direction and fell into step beside her. They didn't touch, but the space between them was almost non-existent. Ethan's heartbeat quickened as they walked together, disappearing behind a heavy metal door marked with a restricted access sign. Ethan stood frozen in place, unsure whether to follow or retreat. His instincts told him that barging in would only create a scene, one that could turn against him. He forced himself to turn away, but the decision left him boiling inside. Back in the cabin, he sat alone, staring out at the endless ocean. The deep blue water shimmered under the sunlight, calm and beautiful, but it felt like a trap. Out here, there was nowhere to escape, no way to walk away and clear his head. He was stuck with his thoughts, trapped in a place where every corner could hide an unpleasant truth. He realized that if something was happening between Claire and the man, it was happening right under his nose. The cruise, which was supposed to save their marriage, might instead be the setting where it finally collapsed. By sunset, Ethan had made a decision. He was going to find out exactly what was happening, even if the answer shattered everything. He couldn't stomach the idea of pretending for the rest of the trip. That night, as the ship glided silently through the dark waters, he began planning how to catch them. He didn't yet know the details, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. If there was a secret, he was going to uncover it before the cruise was over. The third day of the cruise began with a heavy, humid air that clung to everything on deck. Ethan woke early, his mind restless from the uneasy sleep of the night before. Claire was already gone. Her side of the bed was cold, and a faint trace of her perfume lingered in the room. A folded cruise itinerary lay on the table, but it wasn't in her handwriting. He picked it up and saw several events circled: yoga at sunrise, cooking classes, art auctions, but none of them seemed like things Claire would normally attend. It felt staged, almost like a distraction. Ethan pocketed the paper, knowing he would not find her at any of those places. He dressed quickly and left the cabin, walking slowly through the corridors, scanning the crowds. The ship was buzzing with morning activity, couples taking photographs by the railings, families heading toward the buffet, and older guests lounging with coffee. Ethan kept moving, checking each deck methodically. Eventually, he spotted her. Claire was leaning casually near the entrance to the ship's mid-level lounge, her sunglasses perched on her head, a small smile on her lips. Beside her stood the man from the party, the one in the crisp white uniform. The two were standing close enough that their shoulders almost brushed. She handed him something, and though Ethan couldn't see what it was, the exchange was quick and deliberate. Ethan felt the slow burn of suspicion ignite into something sharper. He turned away before they could notice him, pretending to study the framed photographs lining the hallway. When he glanced back, they were already walking together toward a staircase that led up, away from the busier areas. Ethan followed at a distance, staying far enough behind that they wouldn't sense him. They passed the spa entrance, moved past the upper pool area, and then slipped into a narrow passage that led to one of the more secluded decks, a place few passengers bothered to visit. The air there was cooler, the sounds of the crowd replaced by the low hum of the engines and the soft crash of waves against the hull. Ethan watched as they stopped by the railing, leaning on it as if sharing a private view of the horizon. The man gestured toward the sea, and Claire laughed, her hair lifting in the breeze. It was an unguarded laugh, the kind she hadn't given to Ethan in months. He clenched his jaw and stepped back into the shadow of an equipment locker. He stayed there, motionless, for several minutes, trying to steady his breathing. Every instinct told him to march over and demand answers, but something else told him to wait to watch. If he confronted her now, she might deny everything, and he would be left with nothing but his word against hers. He needed something undeniable. When they finally walked away, Ethan slipped back toward the busier parts of the ship. The day dragged on in a haze of forced normalcy. Claire joined him at lunch, acting as if she had spent the morning reading by the pool. She asked about his plans for the evening, and he gave vague answers, pretending not to care. Inside, he was already thinking about how to catch her again. That night, after dinner, Ethan excused himself under the pretense of taking a walk. He roamed the ship for almost an hour before spotting her again. She was alone at first, standing near one of the observation windows on the promenade deck. She seemed restless, checking her watch more than once. A few minutes later, the man in uniform appeared from a side hallway. They didn't speak where anyone could hear, but their body language told its own story. Shoulders angled toward each other, heads bent close. Then, without hesitation, they made their way to the narrow staircase that led to the top deck. The top deck was a place most passengers avoided at night. It was exposed to the wind, the lights were dim, and the sound of the ocean was louder there than anywhere else on the ship. Ethan followed, keeping to the shadows. The staircase creaked faintly under his weight, but the wind masked the sound. As he reached the last few steps, he froze. The deck stretched out in front of him, empty except for Claire and the man. They stood near the bow, the wind tugging at their clothes. The ship's lights cast them in a pale glow, and their figures looked almost like shadows against the dark sea. Ethan ducked behind a metal vent, his pulse hammering in his ears. He could feel the tension in the air between them, a closeness that went beyond casual friendship. Claire reached up, adjusting the man's collar, her hand lingering longer than necessary. He leaned closer, speaking so softly that even the wind couldn't carry the words back to Ethan. The sight was enough to confirm what Ethan had feared all along. Something was happening between them, and it wasn't innocent. A sudden gust of wind rattled the railing, making Claire turn her head. Ethan stepped back quickly, pressing himself against the cold metal. When he looked again, they were gone, having slipped down the opposite stairwell. He remained frozen for a moment before moving, his mind spinning. Now that his suspicion had become certainty, he felt a strange mix of anger and clarity. He knew he couldn't let this continue for the rest of the trip. He would watch them again, but next time, he would be ready to act. The rest of the night passed in restless pacing. In the cabin, Claire was already in bed, feigning the deep, even breathing of someone asleep. Ethan stood at the window, staring out at the black water, his reflection faint against the glass. Somewhere out there, beyond the reach of the ship's lights, the ocean stretched endlessly, cold and indifferent. It occurred to him that on a ship in the middle of nowhere, anything could happen, and no one would ever truly know the full story. That thought lingered as he finally lay down, the hum of the engines vibrating faintly through the floor. And the image of Claire on the top deck burned into his mind like a wound he couldn't ignore. The upper deck was almost silent that night, the kind of silence that makes every small sound seem louder. The steady thrum of the engines vibrated faintly through the metal beneath Ethan's shoes, and the wind cut across the open space, sharp and unrelenting. The lights were sparse here, leaving long stretches of shadow where no one could see clearly. Most passengers never came this far after dark, preferring the bars, lounges, and entertainment inside the ship. For Ethan, that isolation made it the perfect place to confirm what he already suspected. He had chosen his moment carefully, waiting until Claire excused herself after dinner with the same vague explanation she had given before. He followed her at a distance, taking alternate stairwells and keeping to less crowded paths. The ship's layout was etched into his mind now, every shortcut and narrow passage memorized from days of watching. He reached the final set of steps that led to the top deck and slowed his pace, moving in near silence. The wind grew stronger as he climbed, carrying the salty tang of the sea. When his head cleared the last step, he saw them. Claire and the man Marco, according to the small name badge Ethan had glimpsed earlier, stood near the forward railing. The scene was almost surreal in the dim glow of the deck lights. The water stretched out around them like an endless black void, the horizon invisible against the night sky. Marco's posture was relaxed, his hand resting on the railing close to hers, their shoulders nearly touching. Claire's head tilted slightly toward him as if hanging on to whatever he was saying. Ethan stayed low, his body pressed against the shadowed bulk of a lifeboat housing. His heartbeat was rapid, every thud echoing in his ears like a drum. He could see the movement of their bodies, small gestures that spoke volumes. Claire laughed softly, the sound barely audible over the wind, but it cut into Ethan like a blade. He had once been the person who drew that laughter from her. Now it belonged to someone else, someone who had stepped into a place that should have been his. The wind shifted suddenly, and for a moment, the ship's lights flickered. It was only a brief dimming, but it deepened the shadows and left their figures like silhouettes against the faint shimmer of the sea. Ethan's fingers curled into tight fists. He wasn't ready to confront them yet, not here, not like this. Instead, he studied every detail, committing it to memory. The slight lean of her body toward Marco, the way he adjusted her hair when the wind swept it across her face, the unspoken closeness between them, built not on long conversations in public but on quiet moments hidden from others. It was the kind of connection people didn't mistake for friendship. When Marco turned slightly, Ethan caught a glimpse of something metallic in his hand. At first, he thought it was a cigarette case or lighter, but the movement was too subtle. Marco passed it to Claire, who tucked it quickly into her small handbag. The act was smooth, practiced, and intimate. It wasn't just affection, they were sharing things, maybe secrets. That detail hardened Ethan's resolve. This wasn't an innocent flirtation or a moment of weakness. Something deliberate was happening, and he was being played for a fool in front of the entire ship. After several minutes, they moved away from the railing, walking slowly toward the far end of the deck. Ethan stepped deeper into the shadows, letting them pass without being seen. He could hear faint fragments of their voices, but the words were lost to the wind. Their steps echoed softly on the metal floor as they descended a side staircase, disappearing from sight. Ethan stayed where he was for a long moment, staring at the empty space they had left behind. The deck felt colder now, the vast ocean around him darker and heavier. He descended by another route, making sure not to cross paths with them. His mind was no longer clouded by doubt. He had seen enough to know the truth. The cruise had turned into a stage for their betrayal, and he was the silent audience to a show he wanted no part of. Still, anger alone wouldn't serve him. If he acted without thinking, he might find himself accused of jealousy or paranoia. He needed proof so undeniable that even Claire couldn't twist it into something else. Back in the cabin, Claire returned shortly after him, carrying the faint scent of the ship's outdoor air. She said little, moving through her nightly routine with a practiced calm. Ethan barely responded, keeping his eyes on the book he pretended to read. Inside, he was measuring every moment, planning his next move. He thought about the deck's remoteness, how little traffic it saw after dark. A confrontation there would mean no interruptions, no witnesses unless he wanted them. The thought lodged in his mind and refused to leave. The next day, he shadowed them again, refining his timing. Marco's schedule as a crew member gave him freedom to move in and out of passenger areas without drawing suspicion. Claire seemed to adjust her own plans to match his availability, slipping away during events or meals. Ethan began noticing patterns. When Marco finished certain duties, Claire would vanish within minutes. They were careful, but not careful enough. Each time Ethan followed, he stayed just far enough away to avoid notice, his presence blending into the background noise of the ship. By the evening, Ethan felt as if he knew the shape of their entire routine. He could predict where they would go, how long they would stay, and when they would part. But one thing still eluded him, proof strong enough to destroy the facade they were maintaining. That night, he decided the next encounter on the top deck would not end with him hiding in the shadows. He would step forward, not to shout or accuse, but to make them see that he knew. The plan was simple in his mind, yet the possible outcomes played out in dozens of scenarios. None of them ended with the easy restoration of his marriage. As he lay in bed later, the rhythmic sway of the ship beneath him, Ethan's mind kept returning to the image of the two of them framed against the vast ocean. The darkness of the water seemed to mirror the depth of his thoughts, silent, endless, and dangerous. There was something about being out at sea that made everything feel more final. If something happened here, it wouldn't leave the same trail as it would on land. The ocean could take things and keep them forever. And in that stillness, Ethan began to wonder if this cruise would end with more than just the death of a marriage. The fourth evening of the cruise arrived with a deceptive calm. The sun dipped below the horizon in a blaze of orange and deep crimson, casting a warm glow over the ship. Passengers gathered in the grand dining hall for the formal dinner, dressed in their best attire. Ethan wore a tailored dark suit, his expression carefully controlled. No one looking at him would have guessed that he had spent the entire day rehearsing every move for what he was about to do. He had decided this would be the night. The top deck was where it had started for him, where he'd confirmed the betrayal, and it would also be where it ended. From the moment he sat down to dinner with Claire, his every word and gesture was deliberate. He smiled when expected, laughed when appropriate, and gave no indication of the storm building inside him. Claire seemed relaxed, maybe even smug, as though confident that her secret was still hidden. She wore a sleek black dress that caught the light when she moved, her makeup immaculate. Ethan couldn't help but think of how much effort she was putting into this trip, but not for him. Every time she looked away, he let his gaze settle on her face just long enough to memorize her expression. As dessert was served, Claire excused herself. She mentioned needing to get something from the cabin before heading to one of the evening events. Ethan nodded, pretending to be only half listening, but his mind locked onto her every movement. He waited a few minutes, giving her enough of a head start before slipping out of the dining hall himself. The corridor outside was quieter, the sounds of music and laughter fading behind him. He followed at a measured pace, careful not to be seen. Claire took the same narrow side staircase she had used before, one that led toward the upper decks. Her pace was quick, purposeful. Ethan's pulse picked up as he stayed in the shadows. The moment she disappeared from view, he climbed after her, keeping his steps light and even. When he reached the top, the wind greeted him first, a strong, steady force that carried the salt of the ocean. He stayed low, scanning the deck. Claire stood at the far end near the railing, the same spot as before. Marco appeared moments later from the opposite direction, his uniform neat, his movements casual as if this was just another break between duties. They greeted each other in that wordless way Ethan had grown to recognize, a closeness built on repeated, secret meetings. Ethan moved forward, his footsteps muffled by the wind. He was close enough now to hear the low murmur of their voices, though the words were still indistinct. Marco handed her something again, a small object she quickly slipped into her handbag. The gesture was so casual it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else, but Ethan had seen it before. It was part of their ritual, part of the language they had built between them. The ship rocked gently, and the lights overhead swayed slightly, casting moving shadows across the deck. Ethan stepped out from behind a row of deck chairs. The moment he did, Claire's head turned, her eyes widened, and her body stiffened. Marco turned more slowly, his expression unreadable at first, then tinged with recognition. Ethan closed the distance between them in a few slow, deliberate steps. The wind whipped at his jacket, but his focus was unshakable. He didn't need to raise his voice. The force in his presence was enough. The confrontation had been building for days, and now it was here, raw and unfiltered. He looked at Claire first, holding her gaze until she glanced away. Then his attention shifted to Marco, who straightened slightly as if preparing for a challenge. The silence between the three of them stretched on, only broken by the low roar of the ocean and the metallic groan of the ship's frame. Ethan stepped closer, his eyes never leaving Marco's. The air felt heavier now, charged with the kind of tension that could tip into violence with the smallest spark. What happened next was swift. A sudden movement Ethan couldn't even say who acted first sent them all into motion. Marco shifted his stance, perhaps to block Ethan or perhaps to move Claire behind him, but Ethan was already too close. His hand shot out, shoving Marco backward with a force driven by days of rage and betrayal. Marco stumbled, his foot catching on the uneven lip of the deck's flooring near the railing. The world seemed to slow for a split second. Marco's eyes widened, his arms flailing as he tried to regain balance. Then he went over the edge, vanishing into the dark void below. Claire's scream tore through the wind, high and sharp, but it was swallowed almost immediately by the sound of the sea. Ethan froze, gripping the railing and staring into the black water. For a moment, there was nothing but the vast, indifferent ocean stretching into the night. The ship moved steadily forward, leaving ripples in its wake. Claire's hands covered her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. The spell broke when shouts came from the far side of the deck. Crew members, alerted by the scream, were running toward them. Ethan stepped back, his breathing heavy, his mind already racing through what he would say. By the time the first uniformed officer reached them, Claire was pointing toward the water, her voice shaking as she told them Marco had fallen. The next hour passed in a blur. The ship's alarm system called for a man-overboard search. Bright floodlights scanned the waves, and lifeboats were lowered into the churning sea. Passengers gathered at the railings on lower decks, their faces pale and curious. The captain's voice came over the speakers, explaining that a crew member had been lost overboard and that every effort was being made to recover him. But the sea was relentless. The wind picked up, and waves broke hard against the ship's side. Ethan stood near the railing, answering questions from officers with a calm he didn't feel. Claire stayed silent now, her earlier scream replaced by a cold, stunned stillness. The search stretched late into the night, but no sign of Marco appeared. Eventually, the captain announced that rough seas made it too dangerous to continue and that the search would resume at first light. Ethan knew the truth though. Out here, in the vast emptiness of the ocean, a single person could disappear forever in minutes. When they finally returned to their cabin, the weight of what had happened settled like a physical presence between them. Claire avoided his eyes, retreating to the far side of the room. Ethan sat in silence, staring at the reflection of the moon on the water outside their window. In his mind, the image of Marco going over the railing replayed again and again, each time accompanied by the same cold certainty nothing on this cruise would ever be the same again. By morning, the ship was a different place. The cheerful atmosphere of the first days was gone, replaced by a heavy quiet that spread through every deck. Passengers spoke in low voices, their eyes following the uniformed crew members who moved quickly and with purpose. The announcement from the captain confirmed what everyone already knew: Marco had not been found during the night. The sea was calm now, the surface deceptively peaceful, but Ethan knew that calm could be a cruel mask. Out here, the ocean swallowed what it wanted and gave nothing back. Officially, the search continued, but in the minds of most on board, Marco was already gone. Ethan sat at a table in the ship's caf, a cup of untouched coffee cooling in front of him. He kept his expression neutral, aware that people were watching. His mind replayed the moment on the deck again and again, not as a memory but as if it were still happening in real time: the sudden shove, the widening of Marco's eyes, the way his hands had reached for the railing but found nothing. Every detail was burned into him, sharp and unshakable. He wondered if anyone had seen more than they should have. There had been no one on the top deck when it happened, but a single stray witness could unravel everything. Claire joined him without speaking, sliding into the chair opposite. Her eyes were red, though whether from genuine grief or from the shock of the night before, Ethan couldn't tell. She avoided looking at him for long, choosing instead to stare out the window at the endless expanse of blue. In the hours since Marco's disappearance, their marriage had shifted into something colder than it had ever been. They weren't just disconnected anymore, they were bound by a shared, unspoken knowledge of what had happened. It was a secret that would follow them far beyond this voyage. Later that afternoon, Ethan was summoned to speak with the ship's security officers. The meeting took place in a small, brightly lit room on one of the lower decks. The officers were polite but direct, asking him to recount the events leading up to Marco's fall. He kept his answers measured, careful not to add more detail than necessary. He said he had come to the deck after dinner, had seen Marco and Claire talking, and that Marco had stumbled during the strong wind, losing his balance. Ethan described how he had rushed to the railing, trying to spot him in the water, but the darkness had made it impossible. There were no contradictions in his story, nothing that could be disproven without a witness or evidence. The officers asked Claire the same questions separately. When she emerged from the room, she walked past him without a word. Her expression was unreadable, but something in her posture told Ethan she had stayed close enough to his version of events to keep their stories aligned. Whatever else she felt about him, she clearly wasn't ready to invite suspicion onto herself. That evening, the ship held a brief memorial service for Marco. A small crowd gathered near the stern, where the ocean stretched out in a vast, unbroken plain. The captain spoke a few solemn words about the dangers of the sea and the loss of a valued crew member. A wreath of white flowers was lowered into the water, drifting away slowly in the ship's wake. Ethan stood beside Claire, watching the wreath grow smaller until it vanished. Around them, the air was filled with the sound of waves and the faint hum of the engines. The rest of the cruise passed in an uneasy haze. Passengers gave Ethan and Claire a wide berth, some out of respect, others perhaps out of quiet suspicion. Conversations stopped when they entered a room. The top deck, once a place for relaxation and private meetings, was now avoided entirely, its emptiness a constant reminder of what had happened there. Ethan moved through each day as though in a dream, aware that the walls of the ship felt closer than before. When they finally reached the port and disembarked, Ethan felt a rush of relief at stepping back onto solid ground. But the relief was short-lived. In the weeks that followed, rumors began to circulate online. Passengers who had been on the cruise posted vague accounts about the night Marco fell, accounts that hinted at tension, at odd behavior, at a story that didn't quite add up. Claire remained silent, but her distance grew. She slept in a separate room, her interactions with Ethan reduced to the bare minimum. One night, months later, Ethan returned home from work to find an envelope waiting on the doorstep. There was no return address, no markings beyond his name written in unfamiliar handwriting. Inside was a single photograph, grainy and slightly water-damaged, showing a man standing on a rocky shoreline. His back was to the camera, but something about the posture, the tilt of his head, the way his shoulders squared made Ethan's stomach tighten. The man wore clothes that looked old and worn, not the uniform from the ship, but Ethan knew instantly who it was meant to be. There was no note, no explanation, just the photograph. Ethan turned it over in his hands again and again, searching for clues, for something that would tell him if this was real or a cruel trick. He thought of the captain's words, of the flowers drifting away into the sea, of the certainty he had felt that Marco would never return. But certainty, he now realized, was fragile. The ocean could take lives, but it could also carry them to distant shores. That night, Ethan lay awake, every sound in the house amplified in the silence. A branch scraping against the window sounded like footsteps on the porch. The creak of the floorboards in the hallway became a shadow of movement in his mind. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Marco's face in the moments before he went over the railing, shocked, but not afraid in the way a man facing death should be. It was a look Ethan had dismissed at the time, but now it came back to him with a new and unsettling weight. In the weeks that followed, more small signs appeared. A voicemail from an unlisted number with nothing but the sound of waves in the background. A single white flower left on the hood of his car in the middle of the night. The sense that someone was watching grew stronger with each passing day. Ethan's world, once controlled and predictable, had become a place of shadows and unseen movements. He began to dread the sound of the doorbell, the knock on the door, the unexpected letter in the mail. Every moment carried the possibility that the truth or the man himself might come back. Whether Marco had survived or whether someone else wanted Ethan to believe he had, the result was the same. The night on the top deck was not over. It had only changed shape, moving from the open air of the ship into the hidden corners of Ethan's life, waiting for the moment to surface again. The ocean might have kept its secrets, but secrets had a way of finding their way back to shore. And Ethan knew that one day, sooner or later, the knock he feared would come.